We are going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. And we are here today for a book chat about Greg Thalmann's new book, Theocritus, Space, Absence, and Desire, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. If you are just joining us, we invite everyone who can turn on their camera to do so. It is a celebration and conversation among colleagues of a book, and it's much nicer if we can see one another. The order of the program is very simple. We will start with comments by Greg for very briefly, and then he will be joined in conversation by two distinguished guests, Frederick T. Griffiths, who is class of 1880, professor in Greek at Amherst College, and Susan Stevens, who is a former Sarah Hart Kimball professor in the humanities at Stanford University. And of course, the author is William G. Thalmann, Professor Emeritus of Classics and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. The conversation today is moderated by Vincent Farenga, Professor Emeritus of Classics and Comparative Literature at USC. And today's big book chat is co-organized by the USC Department of Classics and the USC Retired Faculty Association and Emeriti Center. After the comments from Greg and the conversation with Rick and Susan, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from everyone in attendance. Please use your Zoom hand function to let Vince know that you have a question. So, Greg, many congratulations on this book, and please tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Daniela. And I want to begin just with thanks to the Levan Institute and for Daniela and the Assistant Director, Isabella Carr, for organizing this very nice event. Also, special thanks to Vincent Farenga, my colleague in comparative literature and classics, my colleague since I came to USC 36 years ago, and our two guests, Susan Stevens and Rick Griffiths, whose work was very important to me when I was writing the book, as anyone can tell from just looking at the footnotes, and their presence here means a lot. I see a number of friends, one even joining us from Germany. So I thank you all for coming. Theocritus isn't exactly a household name among people who are not classicists. May not be a household name among many classicists as well. He deserves to be better known because he's a wonderful, complex, multifaceted poet. And very influential. His bucolic poems stand at the head of the European tradition of pastoral literature, and that means Middle Ages, Renaissance, and long after. He was one of a number of highly experimental poets active in the first half of the 3rd century BCE, some of whom wrote in Alexandria, where they enjoyed the patronage of Ptolemy II and III and access to the great library. And it's likely that Theocritus himself worked in Alexandria, along with those other giants of early Hellenistic poetry, Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes. It's clear, at least, that these poets read and responded to each other's work. And they absorbed into their poetry a lot of the earlier Greek literary and cultural tradition. They did new things with it. And in turn, they heavily influenced later Greek and then Roman literature. So these are very important, interesting poets writing at a very interesting, important time of great transitions in Greek culture. Now, as for the book itself, it represents a convergence of two interests of mine in approaching Greek literature. First, the question of what did a given text produced at a particular cultural moment mean for its contemporary audiences? What particular historical and cultural influences helped shape that work? And what can this text mean for us today? The second interest is in space in literature, an interest that I developed when I was working on an earlier book on Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica. And that led me to read a lot of discussions that had been going on in the social sciences about space for many decades. That really helped put that poem for me into perspective. With Theocritus, I had to take a kind of different approach to space because he's a very different poet. And I want to concentrate for a minute or two on the bucolic poems, especially. We have a collection of about 30 poems that have come down to us under the name of Theocritus. Not all are by him, but I think the majority are. And they do tend to fall into a certain number of categories. And the most influential, as I said, were the bucolic poems. Notice that I'm using the term bucolic rather than pastoral, and that's to distinguish these poems from the later tradition, which developed and became a little different. But they're poems concerned with herders. And I'll say herdsmen because in Theocritus, they are all male. That is shepherds, goatherds, and cowherds. And the bucolic poems on this theme construct a bucolic space, which is a space apart. It's pretty well demarcated, separated from even from other rural spaces, or at least distinguished from them. What happens within this space is a kind of world building of its own. But these poems also concern absences from that space and the desire that those absences provoke. And this is a very stylized space. It obviously has reference to anything anyone would see going out on a Greek hillside, because even in my memory of Greece, you go up in the mountains and you see flocks of goats and sheep and so on. But it really is a space built up in the imagination out of a very few recurring elements, certain kinds of trees and plants, for example, springs and so on, elements of this landscape. And one of the interesting questions I think these poems raise is the whole question of humans in nature. How do they fit in, or do they fit in? And sometimes there are gestures in the poems toward a kind of harmonious relationship where there's this merging of humans and nature. But these moments are always undercut in some ways. Human culture never quite fits into nature. And the poems are partly because the poems are always reminding us that this space is fictional, that it is stylized. And readers are both attracted to it and distanced from it, which tends to be one way of looking at humans' relations to the natural world, for better, or as we're learning more and more every day now, for worse. So the poems more generally raise questions about being in and out of place. What would it mean to fit in, to be in place? And I think, and I try to make this case in the book, that this may reflect anxieties of the Greeks in the world after Alexander's conquests, a world in which the Greeks are really on the move. They are moving to various places. Many of them go to Alexandria, which was rapidly becoming the largest city in the world. It is a place where not only Greeks from all over the Greek world are living, many of them, even speaking somewhat different dialects of Greek from each other, but they're living among Egyptians, people whose culture they always were very curious about and thought of as very ancient and all, but who really were non-Greek and different, other. But also people from other parts of the world living in Alexandria, Phoenicians, Syrians, and everything. So it's a very multicultural city. And this raised certain questions about place and placelessness, about ethnic and other boundaries. What does it mean to be me as a member of a particular culture in surroundings like this? And of course, many of us live in Los Angeles. We're kind of familiar with this. This is kind of our world. And there's, I think, some very indirect reflection on all of this going on in many of the bucolic poems. There are other kinds of poems too in Theocritus, and I'll mention them very quickly and then finish. There are poems on mythological themes. Many of them some of them having to do with Heracles, whom the Ptolemies claimed as an ancestor. And space operates kind of differently there, but these poems raise the question of the relation of the present to the Greek cultural past. There are poems set in cities, where again, space becomes very important, and movement through it. And relations between houses, between buildings, and how these structure human relationships. And there's a kind of spatial creation of hierarchies of power within Alexandria. And finally, poems that I call encomiastic. They're poems of praise of Hieron II of Sicily, and also of Ptolemy, Philadelphus Ptolemy II. And they put all of these other poems in a wider spatial context of the Ptolemaic Empire, where Alexandria exerts a centripetal force on everything. There's a flow of goods and people into it. So all of these things I found fascinating, and that's sort of why I spent some years working on this book. But I will leave it at that and turn things over to Vincent.
Thank you, Greg. That's a terrific overview of, as we already can see, I think, a pretty complex project. But let's go to our first expert, to Professor Stevens at Stanford, for our first question. So, Susan, please.
One of the things that I especially valued about your book was that careful delineation of bucolic space and the way in which you distinguish it from so many other spaces that occur in these poems, the agricultural, the sea, and of course imperial spaces. Now, each new experience of space, as I read the book, led me to realize that space in general is a significant actor in the Idylls as a whole, and you really can't read them without thinking very, very deeply about what the space means. So what I wanted to ask you is, specifically, you construct the bucolic space quite narrowly. Kinds of, as you just said, hills, trees, springs, places to sit, places for grazing animals. But as a consequence of limiting the bucolic space in this way, while it could be located anywhere in the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Arcadia to Crete, the one place it cannot occur is in Egypt, which lacks mountains, trees apart from acacia and palm, and it certainly lacks springs. As such, how do we integrate that bucolic space into the world of the Ptolemies that we see in 14, 15, and 17? Do we think of the bucolic space as loss, that is the price of empire? Or is in fact the writing out of Egypt a specific feature of the bucolic space that we really need to entertain when we read these poems?
I think that's a wonderful question, a wonderful point. It's something that kind of has nagged at me, but I think that your phrase "writing out of," what was it? Writing out of Egypt, right?
Yeah, writing Egypt out of the empire, effectively.
Out of the empire, yeah, is really accurate. There are several different ways you could look at it. You could look at it as sheer nostalgia, longing for that world we left behind when we're here living in Alexandria. But I don't think that's right. I do think that it's a use of the imagination to construct this world that's different and separate from day-to-day experience of poet and readers, but a world from which they can look in a kind of distanced way at their own lives. And that is, again, these questions of being in and out of place and where you fit and how you fit. So it's what Foucault called a heterotopia. So yeah, it's not meant to describe directly the world of Egypt or the natural surroundings of Egypt. It is one that many of his Greek readers were familiar with from earlier experiences, though, before they emigrated. And so it's vivid to them, but it's separate now. Does that answer your question?
It sort of does. I just wonder about the very specific delineation that does mark that's totally separate from any landscape that you could imagine if you lived in Alexandria. You would be very aware that you just don't have these sorts of things. The place is alluvial, totally flat. There are no trees, basically.
Right.
Yet this is the nostalgia. Does it force you to think of that world that you left? Because virtually any place you would have migrated from, with the exception of the Cyrenian coastline, would have all of those features.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that because of that sense in 15 that Egyptians are set apart from Greeks and don't have a cultural relationship with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, it could, and really, I think kind of depends on the particular reader. But sure, I think that it could be a way of actually drawing a kind of Greek cultural experience and a kind of boundary there. We Greeks are familiar with this, even though we're not living in it now, and distinguishing them from Egyptians. In that case, it again plays into this whole question of place and placelessness, I think, in the poems. And I think what you're describing might well be kind of feelings that Greek readers would have in encountering these poems, because as much as I emphasize the stylization, it does have, as I say, reference to things that are actual features of the Greek landscape outside of Egypt. So yeah, I think what you're pointing to is just another dimension to all of this that I think is really valuable and very interesting.
Professor Griffiths, I'd encourage you to jump in if you like.
So I'm tickled by your description of LA as a new Alexandria. So I'm right from Amherst, which is I'll be herding my sheep later in the day. Okay. In fact, on a sentimental note, Greg, that I'm sitting in what was the Greek seminar room at Amherst, where you probably first took courses on Theocritus. So there you go.
That's right.
That's right. So my question is on the bucolic, and people who write on the bucolic rarely go further, and people who write on the chord poetry rarely go further. And so I'm wondering why you took on what Vincent was describing as such a complex project, because at the end of your mind-changing Apollonius book, you talk about the other two greats, Callimachus and Theocritus, and I thought if I had to predict where you might go next, if you're keeping it, it would be Callimachus, which would be much easier, kind of the minister of culture, and where he stands in the court, and he works with real geography, if very eccentrically, whereas Theocritus and his scattered corpus is famously difficult. And in fact, the project you're doing of getting the various the types to go together has pretty much not been done. So I'm wondering what tempted you to go out on that very thin ice. I think brilliantly, but
thanks. Yeah, it was curiosity more than anything, and this feeling of just when I first read Theocritus, I was kind of bewildered by him more than anything, but I felt, gosh, there's something really interesting here if I only could figure out what it was. And that kind of stayed with me as I taught it. And then as I worked on the Apollonius book, I began to give graduate seminars on Alexandrian poetry. We always started with Theocritus. And I was amazed by the intellectual energy that the students brought to discussions of Theocritus. We had just great classes on him. And that really kind of inspired me too. But it was partly just discovery on my part. What I mainly knew were the bucolic poems. And there were some poems I just didn't like. I don't really like praises of autocrats, for example. And then when I got into those poems and began reading, and especially reading your book, Theocritus at Court, I began to see, oh, there's some really interesting stuff here. And I began to discover things about other poems that I had just sort of dismissed. Idyll 5 had always put me off just because of its sheer nastiness. And then when I worked on it a bit, I thought, oh, wow, there's really great stuff here. So it was that challenge, I think. And also, I frankly am I think taking on Callimachus for me would be an act of hubris. You really, because I did come to this from other parts of Greek literature. I haven't, spent my whole career on Hellenistic poetry, and I'm not sure I have the equipment to take on Callimachus. I still find him a bit intimidating. So I love reading him.
So are you willing to confess that you perhaps suffer of what you diagnose in the readers of Theocritus, and which they're projecting onto the herders, of unfulfillable desires, of kind of an endless curiosity and grasping for what is beyond your grasp, which is the sort of the absence and desire you're talking about?
Yeah, very much.
Okay, so as the ideal reader of Theocritus. So I have one more specific kind of question, just to link your work together. You talk about the heterotopia, about kind of a place apart that kind of defines things, and the bucolic world which you define. And you've talked about in Apollonius the Argo, kind of a ship, which is much closer to what Foucault and defined, ship of fools and going around, and you've got a generation of Greeks, and you process cultural issues like the relationship of Greek and not Greek. Could you say more of how the bucolic realm works as that kind of place apart? You mentioned a bit about that in your introduction. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, I think partly the question is why people would read pastoral poetry. And I'm using pastoral to include all of it. That is it a kind of escapism? Is it what do we actually learn from it? Is there this sort of yearning for that simple life, Marie Antoinette at the Petit Trianon stuff, or are there more serious things going on? I think partly, it's easy to say that it's no accident that Theocritus writes bucolic in Alexandria, that this is really a reflex of urbanism. But if you could go beyond that and just say that, that we all need, and one of the other themes of the book, in fact, is our need for the imagination. And that this is a wonderful way of indulging that need, but it's also a complicated one, because the minute we're tempted to feel this sort of nostalgia, and, oh, I would love to be a shepherd out on that hillside instead of all the complexities of my life in this city.
Yeah.
The minute we're tempted to indulge that, we're distanced from it as well. For one thing, just because this poetry is so complicated. It is not a celebration of simplicity. This is, I don't need to tell you or Susan how complicated this is.
Yeah.
It's Empson's putting the complex into the simple, his formula for pastoral poetry. So I think there's more there. And I in the last pages of the book, I kind of tried to come to grips with some of that and think about how different readers might see this, and how, let's say, elite readers, some people say, well, they would look down on these shepherds. There'd be a certain patronizing view, but there might be this other kind of imagination of what it's like to be somebody different in a different setting, and what that does for our own sense of ourselves and others. So that's the best answer I can give. It's a good question. I think it's one that really underlies, the enduring nature of pastoral poetry. Why does anybody read it?
Thank you, Susan.
Let's go. I want to go back to sort of the bucolic space. In Idylls 6, you define the relationship of the two singers, Demoitis and Daphnis, as static symmetry, using the analogy of a pendulum, motion that's limited but repetitive in its scope. The narrow definition raises a question for me. To what extent is bucolic space inevitably static in comparison to the other spaces in the non-bucolic poems that are always in motion or about change? And if so, is stasis significant in constructing the bucolic spaces timeless? Is a figure like Commodus in Idylls 7, who's locked in his coffin and fed on honey, not only a type of the bucolic singer, but is the confined space an analog of the bucolic space that implies that enclosure itself is a requisite for song?
Wow, that's a great complicated question. I love it. It's complicated, but different parts to it. Actually, the pendulum came in when I was talking about the dynamics of desire between the Cyclops, Polyphemus, and Galatea.
I know.
She pretends she's out of love with him, so he pursues her, and then he pretends to be out of love with her, so she pursues him, and it's just there, I think that there is a kind of perhaps a mild implied critique of all of that, because it becomes solipsistic, and the image for that occurs later in the poem with the Cyclops gazing at his own reflection in the water and seeing his beautiful eyeball, but the word for eyeball can also mean girl, and this is what replaces it. But more generally, yeah, it does seem to depend on being enclosed and fairly unchanging. You can see this in the fact that it's never winter there in the genuine bucolic poems. It's always that wonderful moment between late spring and early summer. But at the same time, there's this recognition of the rhythms of nature, the production of young animals and things. So there are certain amounts of change that take place, but really within defined limits. Does it depend on that? I would say yes, for what Theocritus does with it. That is, again, it is felt to be this world apart, and different from, let's say, the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and time there. I should add, by the way, that I expect this very strict definition of bucolic on my part to be pretty controversial, because it does go against the grain of a lot of writing about Theocritus. But I think there are real differences. And
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. Let me say, I think that's the one great thing about your definition. It makes much more sense of the bucolic as a space to have it narrowly defined.
Well, I thank you. I'm relieved to hear that. I really thought I was going to get criticized for that. Not here, but necessarily, but in receptions of the book. But yeah, that's what I can do with that. Is that I'm not sure that's what you were looking for.
Yeah.
I wonder, Greg, if I could jump in with a quick question, and it has to do with the difference between the bucolic as literary space and the space of lived experience in the Greek world. You make allusion several times in the book to the conquests of Alexander the Great, which occurred roughly 2 generations before Theocritus is presumably writing his poetry. And as you put it, those conquests introduced to the Greeks the experiences of Greeks under new conditions of mobility, deracination, issues of interethnic relations, and questions of place and placelessness. So certainly by the time Theocritus is writing, there has been a flood of information pouring into the Greek world pertaining to Alexander and the places and peoples that he encountered. So the Alexander historians are producing their long narratives. People like the first Ptolemy Soter, his History of Alexander, Aristobulus, Cleitarchus, Callisthenes, the so-called royal diaries of Alexander circulating. But then also these are depicting non-Greek worlds of surprising variety and novelty as far east as India and Afghanistan and so forth. And also talking about many disastrous interactions between Greeks and Macedonians on one part and these peoples of Asia on the other part. But then also there are more than tens of thousands of veterans of Alexander's conquests who are pouring back into the Greek world, who have witnessed themselves these places, these encounters, these strange, exciting but terrifying peoples. So I'm wondering, how do you see bucolic as potentially a reaction and a response to both these literary creations of the world that Alexander penetrated, but also these non-literary, very informal oral testimonies on the part of eyewitnesses? So is bucolic in some way an attempt to answer that threat, that disorder, with something which is recognizably purely Greek, and as you put it many times, a world which is very stable, which is timeless, which is a world of repose. It's a world that's very complete and integral, self-enclosed, as it were. So do you see a potential there for a kind of dialogue between this highly literate creation of bucolic time and space, and then these other versions of quite different time spaces where Greeks are encountering non-Greeks in very unpredictable ways?
Sure, I think it's a great way of seeing it. And I hadn't actually thought about Alexander's veterans and bringing back these stories and all, but certainly we know that they did. Yeah, I guess I would wonder if it's provides purely a refuge for them from the turbulence they've encountered, or and something stable, or if just a balance to all of that. And again, I guess it depends on the particular reader or audience of the poem.
Yes, certainly. Well, I think it would be a good moment here to allow our visitors or our audience members to step up if they have questions. And please, if you do, as Daniela suggested, use the hand-raising function of Zoom, and I will try to spot you as quickly as I can. So yes, let's please hear from some of you.
Vincent, would you call on people so they know who speaks first?
Yes, I'm looking for hands.
The first hand I
Okay,
saw was
yes.
Matthew's.
Yes, Matthew, Matt Chaldikas, hi.
Hi, hello from Germany. Hopefully the connection isn't bad. It's late here, so ask for forgiveness if I look tired. It's after 10 now, but it's such a great time to talk about Greg's book. I was in one of those Hellenistic seminars with Aphrodite as well, and it inspired me to keep working on it. So I think Greg's book getting to reach a wider public is a really wonderful thing. I wanted to ask about desire, and this is something that I think I've heard you talk about before, Greg, but it doesn't really come up in this book. And I'm wondering if, when you think about desire in Theocritus, is there an element of this that is also connected to René Girard's mimetic desire, this desire to see something that someone else has and then feel like you're missing it and need to create that for yourself? I mean, I've heard you talk about that in other contexts before, maybe even in that seminar. And I'm curious if that's something that informs some of the way that you think about desire here in this context.
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, not consciously, because I don't see a lot of mimetic desire expressed directly, except as it underlies competitiveness, the kind of competitiveness that comes out in, let's say, poem 5, which is, competition over just about everything. And though it would be hard to say what it is that each of those two herds people are desiring because the other has it. So it to the extent that a mimetic desire underlies competition anyway, it's undoubtedly there, but I can't really see where it plays a central role. So it wasn't really in the forefront of my mind when I was writing. But maybe you have a suggestion about that.
I think you actually mentioned once. I saw the phrase mimetic lust when you were talking, in fact, about Idylls 5 and the way that the goats and are kind of mirroring what's happening in the real world and the connection between human sexuality and goat sexuality. And so I don't know. I think maybe I was trying to see if I could get you to tease something a little bit more out about the connection between desire and absence, but maybe I'm being too abstract with the way that I'm thinking about this. I think you're probably right to be more careful in the way that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, there, it does play there is a connection, obviously, because, I want this because I don't have it, because you do, but no, when I wrote that phrase, it was not, I didn't have Girard in mind.
Okay, let's move on to Heather James from the English department and comparative literature department.
Hello, Greg. As you well know, I'm not a Hellenist. I'm an early modernist with some classical roots, and so much of what you said resonated for what feels to me like my lifetime of studies in literature. One of my teachers was Paul Alpers, and the other relevant is Harry Berger, and they had entirely different ways of approaching the pastoral. Pastoral was for Paul Alpers, very rule coded, and for Harry Berger, a provocation to intense aesthetic and intellectual engagement and questioning. So we can really streamline what I have to say because there are many actual classicists here. But I was thinking about and wondering about your focus on balance in this context of frankly my own education, and wondering if I might want to substitute your idea of balance for fragility, which sounds like an odd substitution, but an interesting one. And so, if fragility is a significant component of the bucolic, as I think it is of the later pastoral, then there is a potential for looking at the response to one's sense of historical and political fragility and geographical fragility, and having as a response to that a kind of aesthetic and intellectual competitiveness, or something. I'm looking for something even stronger, like real competition, which helps establish some kind of emotional distance from sources of historical violence. I'm often known for compressing things, and so I may have compressed that too much, but you and I have known each other so long that you probably decode me readily.
Well, hi, Heather. Thanks for coming, and thanks for the question. I'm not sure that I followed the last move you made from fragility to fierce competitiveness, unless you mean that that's what keeps things going and kind of creates a kind of balance.
Yeah, it's the idea of balance that's intriguing me, because there's also a way in which pastoral keeps you off balance. There's a tendency towards a pictorial positioning of pastoral figures as static, and yet there's a vigorous dialogue and debate going on between and among speakers, and there's a sense of being potentially, as the old idea of pastoral goes, in repose when actually you're probably being unsettled. And of course, I'm moving more to Virgil, where I have more competence. But it made me think. It's been making me think about the idea and the figure of balance in bucolic and pastoral poetry, and how it's so far from simple, which is what I was taking away from much of what you said, and from what your interlocutors have brought up, that balance doesn't mean poise. It can actually contain a great deal of emotion and resistance, under the auspice of balance. And this may go nowhere for you, and if not, then just let's move
No,
on.
I think that's a wonderful point. And first of all, I do think that in this respect, there's a big difference between Virgil and Theocritus. And Virgil responded very much to Theocritus, but he just, it's a totally different context. And so he emphasizes things that Theocritus doesn't. So I'm less aware of that in Theocritus, that threat of that fragility. But that may be, of course, a disguise. It may be exactly the impression that he's trying to give. And in fact, there is one poem that I think shows the bucolic world in the process of disintegration, and where things no longer work the way they do in other poems. That's again, it's a reading that, it's a poem that's been read in many different ways, and this is just one of many possible readings, but the way I read it, that's exactly what's happening. And so there's that sense that things could fall apart, that somebody leaves. And that's what happened. That's the situation at the beginning of this poem. Somebody leaves, and there's nobody, they're only epigonids to pick up the pieces, and they can't do it very well. So yeah, I mean, I think that would go along with very much with what you're saying.
That's wonderful. Which poem is it?
It's poem 4.
Okay.
But again, that's been read in exactly the opposite way by others. So
as all the best pastorals are, at least 7 times.
Right.
I wonder if, with the time remaining, we might return to our interlocutors, Professor Stevens and Griffiths, to see whether they have additional questions or just comments they'd like to make on what's been discussed over the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So let's put the ball back to both Susan and Rick.
Okay, well, I have a quick one on following up on this issue of fragility, which is very interesting, but to make a big shift, one of the most, to me, stunning parts of the analysis is what, Greg, what you do with, in spatial theory, on the fragility of women in urban space. And that's very novel. That's, idle to the poor jilted sorceress, would-be sorceress, and the Syracusan women. Could you say more about that? Because those are really stunning. And those are things I've written on. And I find, what you've done really renews it a lot. And sort of, poor Samaita, the sorceress, who is like Anna Karenina, always out of space. I mean, who is always on, dislocated somehow.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, because you've written so well about these very issues, Rick, that I'm flattered to hear you say that. But yeah, if you put that poem 2 and poem 15 sort of together, these are 2 women out of very different social contexts. And poem 2, for those who don't know, it's about a woman who has had an affair with somebody obviously in a class above her, and who has just then neglected her, and she is trying to use magic to lure him back. It's a fascinating poem. And there, she is so much at the mercy of all these forces that society, it's not made explicit, but it's there. This lover of hers is from the world of the Palestra, which is really for higher class use. And there's this kind of very, there's this play on the spatial distinctions between male and female, that he belongs in the Palestra, the wrestling school, she belongs in the house. And when he comes in, there's there's this, something takes place that from a social point of view shouldn't happen. And you get all of these inversions. She invites him in instead of him forcing his way in. Well, you know all that. She is in control of the scene of seduction, which doesn't happen very often in Greek literature, and so on. And then in poem 15, these two housewives who are probably pretty affluent, but again, leaving the house and going out into the streets of Alexandria, where they are feeling very, jostled by crowds, threatened by these soldiers with their horses and things, but make it to the palace, which is again a female-dominated space. It's the festival of Adonis that is really organized by the queen, but they're only sojourners there, and they have to go back to their lives with their husbands, who get very upset if a meal isn't on time. Your article, Home Before Lunch, it really sums up that situation, the title of your article. So yeah, it is interesting. It's interesting that this appears in a collection beside bucolic poems, where women are not the main figures. They're objects of desire and usually absent. So, there's a certain focus on women in these urban contexts, but very much on their helplessness and questions, especially in poem 2, of what is going to happen to this girl, and we don't know. He leaves it pretty inconclusive.
Well, we have a few moments left. I'd certainly like to give one more time an opportunity to any of you to ask a question. Professor Stevens, do you have any final thoughts?
I think that because I'm more historically than literary in my orientation towards Theocritus, I think the tension between the bucolic and the imperial is a really central issue. And to the extent that you find the bucolic is defined by pretty much a Greek space, it's at risk, and it can be either protected by or endangered by the imperial space. And for me, that's one of the more interesting tensions that you brought out in your book, Greg, the way in which they're in a kind of equilibrium, but it's not clear how they're going to tip. So, that for me is a really interesting problem connected to what I think is both the very static space of bucolic and the fact that it's impervious, in a sense, to human. It's defined in many ways as impervious to human occupation, but it's also a very, very fragile space in literary terms.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'd love to discuss this more with you, Susan, because it's a very interesting point, and I want to thank you all for these comments about fragility, which have really brought out some things for me that were kind of there, but not as conscious as I would have liked. So thank you.
One last question, perhaps, from anyone? A quick one? If not, then I think.
So are you going on to Callimachus? That's our question.
If I summon up the hubris, somehow he just seems so massive, but I would like to try sometime.
Go for it.
In which case I will ask you for a lot of advice.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you who have taken the time to be with us this afternoon. Yes, some of you are classicists and comparatists, but some of you are Far from it. And I really do appreciate, as I'm sure Greg does, your participation and your interest. So I'd like to return to our host, Daniela.
Thank you so much. And I think hubris is a perfect, I love ending on that note. They're always the right sentiment. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Vincent Farenga for moderating, to Rick Griffiths and Susan Stevens for their comments. Above all, congratulations to Greg for his new book, Theocritus, Space, Absence, and Desire. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you all.